The sun hadn't yet crested the jagged mountains when Margaret Walsh stepped out of her adobe house, bucket in hand. The Arizona desert in 1858 was no place for a woman alone, especially not a widow of barely 3 weeks. But here she stood, 26 years old, with calloused hands and a spine straightened by necessity rather than choice. The morning air bit cold against her skin, a sharp contrast to the scorching heat that would arrive by midday. She pulled her shawl tighter and began the quarter-mile walk to the hidden spring that kept her alive in this unforgiving land. Thomas had found it 2 years ago, just days after they'd staked their claim on these 40 acres of dust and dreams. "Lord knows why you picked this spot," she muttered to her late husband's memory, her breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Could have settled closer to town like the Hendersons. But she knew why. Thomas Walsh had been a man who valued solitude over society, independence over convenience. 20 miles from the nearest town meant freedom from prying eyes and wagging tongues. It also meant isolation that could kill you as surely as any rattlesnake. The path to the spring wound through a cluster of ancient cottonwoods, their massive trunks testament to the water flowing beneath the surface. As she descended into the small ravine, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. Here, hidden from the world above, life thrived in defiance of the desert's cruel nature. Margaret set her bucket down beside the spring and knelt at its edge. The water ran clear and cold, bubbling up from some deep aquifer before trickling away into a small pool surrounded by maiden hair ferns and watercress. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. It was then, in that moment of simple pleasure, that she made her decision. For 3 weeks, she'd worn her morning dress every waking hour. For 3 weeks, she'd maintained the facade of the grieving widow, even with no one around to see it. But here, in this secret place that felt more like home than the empty house above, she wanted to be free of it all. Margaret stood and began unbuttoning her black dress with trembling fingers, not from cold or fear, but from a wild exhilaration she hadn't felt since she was a girl swimming in the Connecticut River. The heavy fabric pooled at her feet, followed by her petticoats, corset, and chemise. The cool morning air kissed her bare skin, raising goosebumps along her arms and legs. She should have been scandalized by her own behavior. A proper widow didn't do such things. But propriety had died with Thomas, buried 6 feet under along with her dreams of children and a green garden. She stepped into the pool, gasping as the cold water rose to her knees, then her thighs. The bottom was sandy and soft between her toes. Deeper she went until the water lapped at her chest, and then she submerged completely, letting the spring wash away 3 weeks of grief, sweat, and desert dust. When she surfaced, the first rays of sunlight were painting the cottonwood leaves gold above her. She floated on her back, watching the play of light and shadow, feeling more alive than she had since the fever took Thomas. The water held her, supported her, whispered promises that life would continue despite everything. It was in this moment of peace that she felt it, a presence, a weight of observation that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up despite the water's chill. She didn't thrash or cry out. Instead, she slowly lowered her feet to the sandy bottom and turned in a careful circle, scanning the rim of the ravine. Nothing moved. No sound disturbed the morning except the gentle bubble of the spring and the whisper of cottonwood leaves. Yet the feeling persisted, stronger now. Someone was watching. Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities. Bandits would have already made their move. A mountain lion would have attacked. The Apache and Navajo in these parts had been pushed back by the army, though stragglers remained. Her hand instinctively moved toward where her rifle should have been, finding only water. "Fool woman," she whispered to herself. The gun was with her clothes on the bank, useless as teats on a bull. But as the moment stretched and nothing happened, her fear began to transform into something else. Defiance, perhaps, Or maybe it was the recklessness that comes when you've already lost everything worth losing. She stood straighter in the water, lifted her chin, and continued her bath as if she were alone. If death was watching from the ridge, let it see she wasn't afraid. She had buried her husband, faced down vultures, both the feathered and two-legged kind, and survived. She'd be damned if she'd cower now. When she finally emerged from the pool, she moved with deliberate slowness, wringing water from her long auburn hair. The observer, whoever or whatever it was, remained hidden. She dressed methodically, each piece of clothing armor against the world. Only when she was fully clothed did she pick up the rifle and scan the ridgeline once more. A raven cawed from a dead pine, making her jump. She laughed at herself, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the ravine walls. "Getting jumpy as an old maid," she said aloud, needing to hear a human voice even if it was her own. The walk back to the house felt different. The desert, which had seemed merely hostile before, now felt alive with hidden eyes. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every rustle of wind through sage might herald an attack. Yet, beneath the wariness, that strange exhilaration persisted. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time since Thomas died. Not as the widow Walsh, object of pity and improper desires, but as something else. What exactly, she couldn't say. The adobe house squatted on the rise like a mud turtle, small and defensible. Thomas had built it well, with thick walls and deep-set windows that could serve as gun ports if needed. She barred the door behind her and set the water bucket on the rough wooden table. As she prepared her meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and the last of the bacon, her mind kept returning to the spring. Who had been watching? Why hadn't they shown themselves? And most troubling of all, why wasn't she more afraid? The morning progressed with the monotonous chores of survival, feeding the two scrawny chickens that had survived the coyotes, checking the vegetable garden that struggled despite her constant attention, mending a tear in her only good dress. But her thoughts remained elsewhere, circling back to that moment in the water when she'd felt utterly exposed, yet strangely powerful. It was near noon when she heard the horses. 3 riders approached from the direction of town, dust plumes rising behind them like smoke signals. Margaret watched from the window, rifle in hand. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider's slouch before she could make out his face. Jake Colton, owner of the largest freight company in the territory, and a man who'd been sniffing around her skirts even before Thomas was cold in the ground. She stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in her arms. "That's close enough, Mr. Colton." Jake reined in his bay gelding, his companions flanking him. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Afternoon, Mrs. Walsh. Come to see how you're managing out here all alone." "Managing fine." She kept her voice steady, though her palms were slick with sweat against the rifle stock. "Now, that's what I like to hear." Jake leaned forward in his saddle, his pale eyes roving over her property with the calculating look of a man tallying assets. "Though I wonder how long a woman alone can keep this up. Desert's no place for the gentler sex without protection." "I have all the protection I need." She shifted the rifle slightly, making sure the sunlight caught the barrel. Jake's companions chuckled. One of them, a scar-faced man she didn't recognize, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "That scattergun won't do much good against a determined man. Or men." "Samuel's right," Jake said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "You need a man's strength out here. Margaret, may I call you Margaret? I feel we've known each other long enough." "You may not, and I'll thank you to state your business or move along." Jake's friendly mask slipped for a moment, revealing something uglier beneath. "My business is making you a fair offer. This land ain't worth much, but I'm willing to take it off your hands for a decent price. Enough to set you up comfortable in town, maybe even enough for passage back east if that's your preference. My preference is to be left alone on my own land." "Your land?" Jake laughed, an unpleasant sound like a crow's caw. For how long you can't work 40 acres by yourself? Can't protect it neither. Lot of dangers out here for a woman alone. Renegade Indians, bandits, all manner of unfortunate accidents. The threat hung in the air between them, naked as she had been in the spring that morning. Margaret's finger found the trigger of the rifle. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Colton?" "Threatening?" Jake pressed a hand to his chest in false shock. "I'm offering to help, but my patience ain't infinite. You think on it, Mrs. Walsh. Think real hard, because next time I come calling, might be my offer's not so generous." He wheeled his horse around, his men following. As they rode away, Jake called back over his shoulder, "Oh, and you might want to be careful where you do your bathing. Never know who might be watching. Dangerous times. These..." Margaret's blood turned to ice. He knew. Somehow. Jake Colton knew about her morning bath, which meant his men had been watching, or... She remained on the porch until the riders disappeared into the heat shimmer, her mind racing. If Colton's men had been at the spring, they would have done more than watch. Men like that didn't have the restraint, which meant her observer had been someone else. As the sun peaked and began its descent toward the western mountains, Margaret made a decision that would have scandalized her proper Connecticut upbringing. Come tomorrow morning, she would return to the spring, and she would bathe again. If someone was watching, let them watch. She'd rather face an unknown observer than the very known threat of Jake Colton. And perhaps, in some way she didn't fully understand, the watching presence had kept her safe. For now. The desert evening brought its usual symphony of sounds, coyotes yipping in the distance, the whisper of wind through sage, the settling of the house's wooden bones. Margaret cleaned her rifle, checked the bars on the windows, and prepared for another night alone. But as she lay in the narrow bed she'd shared with Thomas, her thoughts drifted to the spring, to the weight of unseen eyes, to the strange liberation she'd felt standing naked in the cold water. Tomorrow, she would return, and perhaps tomorrow, her silent observer would reveal himself. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself almost looking forward to it, to any break in the crushing loneliness of widowhood in this hard land. Outside, the desert moon rose full and bright, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, someone else lay awake, thinking of the red-haired woman who'd stood proud and unashamed in the hidden spring, like some ancient goddess of water and light. The desert kept its secrets, but come dawn, some of them might finally be revealed. Karuk moved through the pre-dawn darkness like smoke, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. He had been watching the white woman's homestead for 3 days now, trying to understand why she remained when her man had died. Most whites fled this harsh land at the first sign of trouble, yet she stayed, stubborn as a desert mesquite. He settled into his observation post among the granite boulders above the spring, the same place he'd been yesterday when she'd surprised him with her actions. In his 28 years, he'd seen many things that confused him about the white people, but nothing quite like the widow Walsh's dawn ritual. The Navajo warrior pulled his blanket closer against the morning chill and waited. His band had moved south 2 moons ago, avoiding the increasing army patrols, but Karuk had remained behind to scout the movements of the whites encroaching on their traditional lands. The widow's farm sat on what had once been a summer camping ground for his people, near the sacred spring his grandmother had called Heart of Earth. He heard her coming before he saw her. The white people moved through the desert like wounded buffalo, all noise and disturbance. Yet there was something different about her gait this morning, a deliberateness that made him lean forward slightly. She emerged from the cottonwood shadows carrying her rifle this time, along with the water bucket. Karuk nodded approvingly. She was learning, though she held the weapon awkwardly, like someone unaccustomed to constant vigilance. Margaret, he'd learned her name from listening to the men who'd visited yesterday, paused at the edge of the spring and set down her burdens. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, and Kuruk had the unsettling feeling she was looking directly at his hiding spot, though he knew the pre-dawn gloom made him invisible. "I know you're there," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the still air. "I don't know who you are, but you were here yesterday. You saw me." Kuruk remained motionless, years of training keeping even his breathing silent. She couldn't possibly see him. Margaret continued speaking to the darkness. "Those men who came yesterday, they're not good men, but you didn't hurt me when you could have. So I'm thinking you're either not one of them, or you're playing a longer game." She began unbuttoning her dress with steady fingers, her movements deliberate rather than hasty. "Either way, I won't live in fear. I've got too much work to do to spend my days jumping at shadows, so if you mean me harm, best get it over with. Otherwise—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "Otherwise, I suppose we'll just have to get used to each other." The dress fell away, followed by her undergarments, and she stood naked in the growing light. This time, Kuruk could see her clearly, the pale skin marked by sun on her arms and face, the curves and angles of a body shaped by hard work rather than leisure. She was beautiful in the way of his people's stories about First Woman, strong and unashamed. She entered the water slowly, and Kuruk found himself holding his breath among his people. To watch someone bathing was considered deeply inappropriate, a violation of privacy that could bring severe punishment. Yet he couldn't look away. It wasn't desire that held him, though he was not immune to her beauty, but something else, a recognition, perhaps, of another spirit refusing to bow before the harsh world. When she emerged and dressed, she spoke again. "I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after. This is my spring now, my place of peace. If you're going to watch, at least have the courtesy to show yourself eventually." She gathered her things and left, and Kuruk remained frozen in place long after her footsteps faded. His grandmother would have scolded him fiercely for such behavior. His brother would have laughed and called him a fool, but both were gone now, victims of the white man's diseases and bullets. He waited until the sun was fully up before moving, his joints stiff from stillness. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye, a small bundle placed carefully on a flat rock near the spring's edge. He approached cautiously, half expecting a trap. It was a cloth wrapped around 2 corn cakes, still warm, and a small container of honey. Kuruk stared at the offering, his mind racing. She had known he was there. More than that, she had left him food, as one might leave offerings at a shrine. He should leave it untouched. He should return to the temporary camp where his nephew waited, report on the widow's activities, and move on. That was the safe path, the wise path. Instead, he found himself sitting by the spring, eating the corn cakes slowly. They were good, better than the hard biscuits the trading posts sold. The honey was a luxury he hadn't tasted in months. As he ate, he considered the puzzle of Margaret Walsh. White women, in his experience, were either terrified of his people or condescending, viewing them as savages to be converted or creatures to be pitied. But this woman had stood naked before him without fear, had spoken to him as an equal, had left him food as one would a neighbor. Perhaps she was mad. The desert sun could break white minds unaccustomed to its power, or perhaps grief had unmoored her from the strict rules of her people. Either way, she presented a complication he hadn't expected. Kuruk spent the rest of the day watching the homestead from a distance. She worked tirelessly, hauling water, tending the struggling garden, repairing a fence section that had collapsed. When 3 riders appeared on the horizon, he tensed, but they were only passing through, heading south toward Mexico. As evening approached, he made a decision that would have puzzled his surviving family. He tracked a fat jackrabbit through the sage, killed it with a single arrow, and cleaned it carefully. Then, under cover of darkness, he approached the homestead. The house was built well for defense, he noted with approval. The man who'd constructed it had understood the dangers of this land. Karuk placed the rabbit on the porch, wrapped in sage leaves, and retreated before the dogs could catch his scent. The next morning, he was in position early, curious whether she would come after finding his gift. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when he heard her approach. This time her steps were lighter, more confident. She emerged into the clearing by the spring carrying not just her bucket and rifle, but a small basket. She set everything down carefully and spoke to the darkness. "Thank you for the rabbit. It's been weeks since I had fresh meat." She paused, then added with a touch of humor, "Though I'll admit it gave me a start. Finding it on my porch, nearly shot my own door." Karuk found himself almost smiling at the image. Margaret began her morning ritual, and again Karuk watched, though now he was beginning to understand it differently. This wasn't about bathing, or not just about bathing. It was about claiming something for herself in a world that seemed determined to take everything away. The spring was her sanctuary, the one place where she could drop the burden of being the widow Walsh and simply be Margaret. When she finished and dressed, she spoke again. "I left more corn cakes and some preserves from the berries I put up last fall. I don't know if your people eat such things, but they're good on the corn cakes." She indicated the basket she'd brought. "I figure if we're going to be neighbors of a sort, we might as well be civilized about it, though I'd still prefer to know who I'm sharing breakfast with." For a moment, Karuk almost revealed himself. The impulse was so strong he actually shifted his weight, preparing to stand. But generations of caution held him back. Not yet. Not until he was certain of her intentions, and more importantly, certain that revealing himself wouldn't bring danger to them both. After she left, he retrieved the basket, finding not just corn cakes and preserves, but also a small wrapped package. Inside was a hunting knife, well made and sharp, with a simple leather sheath. The gift stunned him. Among his people, to give someone a weapon was a sign of profound trust and respect. Did she understand the significance of what she'd done? Or was it mere coincidence? He spent the day alternating between watching her work and crafting his response, using skills his father had taught him. He wove a small basket from willow shoots, waterproofed with pine pitch. Into it, he placed dried venison, piñon nuts, and something more precious, a small turquoise stone his mother had given him, polished smooth by generations of handling. That night, he left his gifts on her porch, taking care to arrange them in the traditional pattern of peaceful intent his people used when approaching strangers. So began a strange routine. Each morning, she would come to the spring, bathe, and speak to him as if he were sitting beside her. She told him about her life, her childhood in Connecticut, her marriage to Thomas, their dreams of building something lasting in this unforgiving land. She spoke of her fears, her loneliness, her determination to survive despite everything. And each day, they would exchange gifts. She left food, small tools, once a precious bar of soap. He reciprocated with game, traditional foods, and items that might help her survive. A rain cape woven from yucca fibers, a container of salve his people used for healing, arrows for hunting small game. On the 7th day of this strange courtship, everything changed. Karuk was in his usual position when he heard horses approaching from the north. Many horses, moving fast. He recognized the danger immediately and was already moving when the first riders crested the ridge. Jake Colton had returned, and this time he'd brought 6 men. They thundered down toward the spring, and Karuk realized with cold certainty that they knew about Margaret's morning ritual. They intended to catch her here, vulnerable and alone. But they had underestimated her. Margaret heard them coming and was already reaching for her rifle when they burst through the cottonwoods. She stood knee-deep in the spring, water streaming from her body, but the rifle in her hands was steady. "That's far enough. Colton!" she called out, her voice sharp as winter wind. The men spread out, trying to flank her, and Karuk saw the situation's deadly mathematics. 7 men, One woman, shallow water that would slow her movements. Even with the rifle, she couldn't stop them all. Without conscious thought, he knocked an arrow and drew his bow. The arrow whispered through the air and buried itself in the ground between Colton's horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider, and all eyes turned to scan the ridgeline. Karuk showed himself then, standing tall against the lightening sky. He had another arrow ready, the bow drawn and aimed at Colton's chest. The message was clear. The next one wouldn't miss. "Indians," one of the men shouted, and Karuk saw hands moving toward weapons. He released the second arrow, this one taking the hat off the man who'd gone for his gun. Then he gave a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls. The cry of his people, a sound that had terrified white men for generations. It was a bluff. He was one man with a bow against 7 with guns. But the whites didn't know that. And in their moment of confusion, Margaret acted. She fired the rifle, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. Her shot was deliberately high, but close enough to part Jake Colton's hair. "The next one won't miss," she said calmly, already reloading. "And neither will his. Now get out, all of you. Get out and don't come back." Colton's face was purple with rage and fear. "You're consorting with savages now. Woman, you've lost your mind." "Maybe I have," Margaret replied. "Mad enough to shoot you if you don't leave. Mad enough to have friends who'll finish what I start. Your choice, Mr. Colton." For a moment, the tableau held 7 mounted men, one woman standing fierce and unashamed in the water, and the silent warrior on the ridge with his drawn bow. Then Colton spat into the dust and wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot. The army will hear about this. They'll come for your redskin friend, and then we'll see how brave you are." They rode out in a cloud of dust and curses, and Karuk maintained his position until they were well gone. Only then did he lower his bow and look down at the woman in the spring. Margaret looked back, and for the first time their eyes met across the distance. She didn't cover herself or show fear. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, a greeting, an acknowledgement, a thank you all in one. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Well, I suppose we've been properly introduced now, though I still don't know your name." Karuk found himself speaking before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. "Karuk," he called down. "In your language, it means bear." "Karuk," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar sounds. "I'm Margaret, but I suppose you already knew that." He nodded, still processing the strangeness of actually speaking to her after days of one-sided conversations. "Will they come back?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," he replied simply. "With more men, and they will report to the army about me." "Then we're both in trouble," she said matter-of-factly. She had finished dressing while they talked, transforming back into the modest widow. But Karuk had seen her true self, fierce as a mountain cat, proud as an eagle. "You should leave," he told her, "find safety in the town." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Safety with men like Colton? No, this is my home. I'll defend it or die trying." "Then you will die," he said bluntly. "Maybe," she agreed. "But at least I'll die free. Can you understand that?" Karuk looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he understood. It was the same choice his people faced every day. "I must go," he said finally. "My presence brings danger to you." "Your presence saved me today," she countered. "Besides, I don't think Mr. Colton will make distinctions. In his mind, I'm already contaminated by association." She was right, and they both knew it. By showing himself, by defending her, Karuk had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Tomorrow?" she asked, and he heard vulnerability in her voice for the first time. "Will you come tomorrow?" He shouldn't. Every instinct screamed against it, But looking down at her, brave, foolish, magnificent Margaret Walsh, he knew his answer. Tomorrow, he agreed. As he melted back into the landscape, Karuk reflected on how much had changed in a single moment. He had been a watcher in the shadows, safe in his solitude. Now he was something else. Protector, perhaps, or ally. Or something more dangerous still, a man who had looked into the eyes of a woman who saw him not as savage or enemy, but simply as Karuk. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Soon, the heat would become oppressive, driving all but the most desperate into shade. But for now, in the sweet coolness of morning, two people from different worlds had found something precious and rare, understanding. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. Colton would return, perhaps with the army. Decisions would have to be made, sides chosen, prices paid. But that was tomorrow. Today, Karuk had spoken her name, and she had spoken his. And, for now, that was enough. The morning after their confrontation with Colton, Margaret arrived at the spring to find something unexpected, a clearly marked trail leading up to the ridge where Karuk had stood. Small stones had been arranged in a pattern her late husband had once told her meant safe passage among the local tribes. She followed the path, rifle in hand but pointed downward, until she reached a small cleared area among the boulders. There, placed on a flat stone, was a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside, she found strips of dried meat, a handful of piñon nuts, and something that made her breath catch, a small carved bear, no bigger than her thumb, crafted from some dark wood she didn't recognize. Bear, she said softly, understanding. Karuk, he had given her his namesake. She sat among the rocks for a moment, holding the tiny bear up to catch the morning light. The carving was exquisite, each detail rendered with patient skill. How many hours had he spent creating this, and why give it to her? Back at the spring, she completed her morning ritual with new awareness. She no longer felt like she was performing for an unknown observer. Now she knew his name, had seen his face, heard his voice. The dynamic had shifted, though she wasn't quite sure how to define what they were to each other now. Before leaving, she placed her own offering on the stone-fresh bread still warm from her dawn baking, a jar of apple butter she'd been saving, and after a moment's hesitation, a small leather-bound book of poetry that had been Thomas's favorite. She wasn't sure if Karuk could read English, but perhaps he would appreciate the gesture. The day passed with unusual quietness. No riders appeared on the horizon. No dust clouds marked approaching danger. Margaret worked her land with one eye always watching, the rifle never far from reach. The little carved bear rode in her apron pocket, and she found herself touching it periodically, as if to assure herself the morning's exchange had been real. That evening, as she prepared her simple supper, she heard a sound that made her freeze, a gentle knock at her door. Not the demanding pound of Jake Colton or his men, but a polite rap, almost hesitant. She approached the door with a rifle ready. "Who's there?" "Karuk." Her heart hammered as she lifted the bar and opened the door. He stood on her porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. In the lamplight spilling from her kitchen, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome in any culture. His hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore a mix of traditional clothing and traded goods, deerskin leggings, a cotton shirt, boots that had seen better days. "May I come in?" he asked, his English careful but clear. She stepped aside wordlessly, still processing the strangeness of having him here, in Thomas's house, in her house. Karuk entered with the same caution he might show approaching a wild animal. His eyes took in everything quickly, the sparse furnishings, the defensive positions, the widow's weeds she'd hung on a peg and not touched since that first morning at the spring. "Why have you come?" she asked, setting the rifle against the wall but keeping it within reach. "To warn you," he said, "and to understand." She gestured to the rough wooden chair Thomas had made. "Sit, I'll make coffee." He sat carefully, as if the chair might break beneath him. Margaret busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her hands. "My nephew scouts for the army sometimes." Karuk began without preamble. "He told me they plan to come here in 3 days. Colton has made accusations. They will ask questions about me, about us." "There is no us," Margaret said automatically, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, we've done nothing wrong. You saved me from those men." "That is not how they will see it." His dark eyes met hers steadily. "A white woman alone, befriending an Indian man. They will make it into something ugly." Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "Everything in this territory becomes ugly eventually. That doesn't mean we have to accept it." Karuk wrapped his hands around the tin cup, seeming to draw comfort from its warmth. "You speak strangely for a white woman." "And you speak excellent English for—" She paused, catching herself. "For a savage," he smiled slightly, taking the sting from the words. "The missionaries taught me when I was young, before I understood the price of their teachings." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping the bitter coffee. Finally, Margaret asked the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "Why did you watch me that first morning?" Karuk considered his answer carefully. "At first, curiosity. Why did you stay when your man died? Most whites flee difficulty. Then," he paused, searching for words, "you stood in the water like you belonged there, like the spring had accepted you. My grandmother would have said the spirits were showing me something important." "And what did they show you?" "That you are not like the others. You don't try to take the land. You ask it to accept you. You leave offerings. You understand reciprocity." Margaret thought about this. "Thomas used to say I was too soft-hearted for frontier life. Said I'd never make a proper pioneer wife. Your Thomas was wrong," Karuk said firmly. "You have the strength of water, soft enough to flow around obstacles, hard enough to wear down mountains." The poetic image surprised her, and she found herself really looking at him for the first time, not as an Indian or a potential threat, but as a man who carved tiny bears and spoke of water wearing down mountains. "The book you left," he said suddenly. "I cannot read all the words, but I recognize some. Your husband had learning." "He was a teacher before we came west," Margaret confirmed. "Said he was tired of shaping young minds and wanted to shape the land instead." She laughed bitterly. "The land shaped him into a grave." "I am sorry for your loss," Karuk said formally. Then, more quietly, "I too have lost my wife 2 winters ago. The spotted sickness your people brought." "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, understanding dawning. They were both refugees from grief, finding solace in an unexpected connection. "This is why I watched," he continued. "You grieved but did not die inside. You found joy in the water, in the morning light. It reminded me that such things were still possible." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "And now, why reveal yourself? Especially when it puts us both at risk." "Because hiding in shadows is another kind of death," he said simply. "And because you deserve to know who shared your sanctuary." She rose abruptly, needing movement. At the window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "What do we do when the army comes?" "You tell them truth. I am a man who sometimes hunts near the spring. You are a woman who bathes there. We have exchanged food as neighbors do, nothing more." "They won't believe it." "No," he agreed. "They won't." She turned back to face him. "You should leave. Take your nephew and go far from here." "My nephew is safe with his mother's people, but I will not run." He stood, seeming to fill the small kitchen. This is my land too. My father's bones rest in these hills. My grandmother drew water from that spring when she was a girl. I have as much right to be here as any white man." "Rights don't matter when they have guns and numbers," Margaret said practically. "Then what does matter?" She thought about it, absently touching the carved bear in her pocket. "Choices, I suppose. The choice to be brave or cowardly, to be kind or cruel, to trust or fear." "And what do you choose?" Margaret met his eyes squarely. "I choose to keep going to the spring. I choose to leave food for my neighbor. I choose not to let Jake Colton or the army or anyone else tell me how to live on my own land." Karuk smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "You would have made a good Dine woman." "Is that your people, the Dine?" "It is what we call ourselves. It means the people. The whites call us Navajo." "Dine," she repeated, trying to wrap her tongue around the unfamiliar sound. "And how do you say friend in your language?" His smile softened. "Akis, but it means more than your word friend. It means someone who is part of your life, who you would share your last water with." "Akis," Margaret said carefully. "Is that what we are?" "Perhaps," he said, "if you choose it." Before she could respond, he moved to the door. "I should go. It is not safe for either of us if I am seen here after dark. Will you come to the spring tomorrow?" He paused at the threshold. "Not to watch, but perhaps to talk as Akis do." "I'd like that," she said softly. After he left, Margaret barred the door and leaned against it, her heart still racing. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, as if his presence had permanently altered the space. She picked up his empty coffee cup, noting how carefully he'd placed it on the table, how he'd taken nothing for granted in her home. 3 days until the army came. 3 days to figure out how to protect this fragile, nameless thing growing between them. Not love. She wouldn't call it that. Not yet. But something rarer, perhaps understanding between two people who should have been enemies. Trust where there should have been fear. Friendship where there should have been nothing at all. She prepared for bed methodically, checking windows, banking the fire, ensuring the rifle was within reach. But when she lay down, she didn't think of danger or armies or Jake Colton's threats. Instead, she thought of poetry and carved bears, of spotted sickness and shared grief, of the word akis and what it meant to choose connection in a world that demanded separation. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. But for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret didn't feel alone. Somewhere in the darkness, Karuk was making his way home, carrying with him the memory of their conversation, just as she carried the small wooden bear. Tomorrow they would meet at the spring, not as watcher and watched, but as two people choosing to build something in defiance of a world that would tear it down. It was dangerous, probably foolish, certainly doomed. But tonight, with his words still echoing in her kitchen and his gift safe in her hand, Margaret found she didn't care. She had made her choice. Let the world do its worst. The spring would still bubble up from the earth tomorrow. The cottonwoods would still whisper their ancient secrets. And two unlikely friends would meet in the space between their worlds, crafting something new from sorrow and hope and the simple act of seeing each other clearly. It was, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, more than most people ever got. And for now, it was enough. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon on the third day. Exactly as Karuk had predicted. Margaret watched from her doorway as 8 riders approached. Jake Colton, his 2 regular men, and 5 soldiers in army blue, their brass buttons glinting in the harsh sun. She smoothed her dress, checked that her hair was properly pinned, and stepped onto the porch with her rifle. Not pointed at anyone, just present, a reminder that she was no helpless victim. The lead soldier, a captain by his insignia, raised a hand to halt the group at a respectful distance. He was younger than she'd expected, with sun-weathered features and intelligent gray eyes that took in everything about her property in a quick sweep. Mrs. Walsh, he called out. I'm Captain Samuel Morrison, Fort Defiance. Might we have a word? You can speak from there, Captain, Margaret replied evenly. State your business. Jake Colton started to spur his horse forward, but the captain held up a hand. Mr. Colton, you'll remain silent unless I address you directly. He turned back to Margaret. Ma'am, we've received reports of Indian activity in this area, specifically that you've been interacting with a Navajo warrior. I've seen natives near the spring, Margaret said truthfully. We've had no trouble. No trouble, Jake burst out, ignoring the captain's warning. She's been meeting with him alone. God knows what unholy... Mr. Colton. Captain Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. One more outburst and I'll have you escorted back to town. Margaret felt a flutter of hope. This officer seemed different from the Indian-hating soldiers she'd heard about. Hey, Mrs. May Walsh. The captain continued. I'm going to dismount and approach. If that's acceptable, I'd prefer to discuss this without shouting. She nodded, and he swung down from his bay gelding with easy grace. He approached slowly, hands visible, and stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. Ma'am, I need you to understand the situation. The territory is on edge. There have been raids to the north, settlers killed. Any interaction between whites and Indians is viewed with suspicion. I'm aware of the tensions. Captain, my husband and I chose this location precisely because it was away from such troubles. Yet troubles seem to have found you. His eyes were sympathetic but firm. Mr. Colton claims a Navajo warrior has been stalking you, that he threatened Mr. Colton and his men with violence. Margaret laughed, a short, bitter sound. Captain Morrison, Mr. Colton and 6 men surrounded me while I was bathing. They made threats of their own before any warrior appeared. If someone hadn't intervened, I doubt we'd be having this civilized conversation. The captain's jaw tightened, and he shot a dark look at Colton. That wasn't in the report I received. I'm sure it wasn't, just as I'm sure Mr. Colton didn't mention his repeated attempts to force me off my land, or his suggestions that a widow needs a man's protection whether she wants it or not. Now see here, Colton started, but the captain wheeled on him. Mr. Colton, if you cannot remain silent, you will leave. Now. He turned back to Margaret. Ma'am, regardless of the circumstances, I need to know about this Navajo. Has he threatened you, demanded anything? Margaret considered her words carefully. There is a man who hunts near the spring. We've exchanged food a few times, as neighbors might. He's shown me nothing but respect. You know him well enough to judge his character. I know Jake Colton well enough to judge his. She replied, Given the choice of which man I'd rather encounter alone, it wouldn't be the white one. One of the soldiers snickered, quickly covering it with a cough when his sergeant glared at him. Mrs. Walsh, the captain said patiently. I'm trying to help here, but if this continues, I'll have orders to clear out any Indians in the area. That means tracking them down. Possibly. He was interrupted by movement on the ridge. Everyone turned, hands moving to weapons, as a lone figure appeared against the sky. Karuk sat his paint horse calmly, making no threatening moves. He was dressed formally. Margaret had learned enough to recognize the significance of his decorated shirt and the eagle feather in his hair. This was diplomatic dress, the native equivalent of a flag of truce. Nobody shoot, Captain Morrison ordered sharply. He's showing peaceful intent. Karuk guided his horse down the slope with unhurried grace. He stopped well outside rifle range and called out in clear English, I am Karuk of the Bitterwater clan. I wish to speak with the army chief. The captain looked at Margaret, then back at Karuk. Well, he muttered, this is unexpected. Louder, he called. Approach slowly. Keep your hands visible. Karuk rode forward until he was perhaps 20 feet away. Up close, Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his eyes, but his face remained calm, dignified. "You are the one they speak of?" Morrison asked. "The one who's been near Mrs. Walsh's property?" "I hunt these lands." Karuk said simply, "My father hunted them, and his father before him. The spring is sacred to my people." "Sacred or not, it's on Mrs. Walsh's land now." Karuk's eyes flicked to Margaret for the first time. "The land belongs to no one. We are only its temporary guardians. But yes, by your laws, she has claimed it. I respect this. Do you also respect that any harm to her or any white settler will bring the full force of the army down on your people?" "I have harmed no one. I defended a woman from men who would dishonor her. Is this not also your law?" Jake Colton couldn't contain himself any longer. "Don't listen to him. He's been sniffing around her like a dog in heat. Everyone knows what these savages want with white women." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face burned with anger and humiliation. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Even Captain Morrison looked disgusted. But it was Karuk who responded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone listen. "Among my people," he said, looking directly at Colton, "a man who speaks so of a woman reveals only his own nature. We have a saying, the coyote sees his own shadow and thinks all creatures slink in darkness." He turned to the captain. "This man covets what is not his, the widow's land, the widow herself. When she refuses him, he creates lies to remove those he sees as obstacles. You are a warrior. You know the smell of truth and lies. Which do you smell here?" Captain Morrison studied Karuk for a long moment, then turned to survey the scene. Margaret standing proud on her porch, Karuk sitting his horse with calm dignity, and Jake Colton red-faced and sputtering. "Mr. Colton," he said finally, "I've heard enough. Your complaint appears to be more about rejected advances than any real threat. I suggest you return to town and reconsider your interest in Mrs. Walsh's property." "You're taking the word of a savage over a white man," Colton exploded. "I'm taking the word of two credible witnesses over one whose motivations are transparently selfish," Morrison replied coldly. "Sergeant, escort Mr. Colton and his men back to the main road. If they're not gone in 5 minutes, arrest them for interfering with army business." As Colton was led away, cursing and threatening legal action, Captain Morrison turned back to Margaret and Karuk. "This isn't over," he warned. "Colton has friends, influence. He'll make trouble." He looked at Karuk. "And you, warrior, your presence here complicates things. The peace between our peoples is fragile. Peace built on lies is no peace at all." Karuk replied, "Only truth endures, like stone, like water." Morrison sighed. "Philosophy aside, I need practical solutions. Mrs. Walsh, you can't stay out here alone. It's too dangerous, too isolated." "This is my home," Margaret said firmly. "I won't be driven off by threats or fear." "And you," Morrison asked Karuk, "will you continue hunting these lands?" "The deer do not ask permission to seek water. The hawk does not request leave to ride the wind. I will go where I have always gone." The captain rubbed his face tiredly. "You two are going to give me gray hair before my time." He came to a decision. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to report that I investigated and found no evidence of hostile Indian activity. Mrs. Walsh is managing her property adequately and has had no conflicts with the local tribes. As for you," he looked at Karuk, "officially, I never saw you. Understood?" Both Margaret and Karuk nodded. "But," Morrison continued, "I strongly advise caution. Colton won't give up easily, and if there's any incident, any excuse for military intervention, I won't be able to protect either of you." He mounted his horse. "Mrs. Walsh. There's a widow in town, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper. She takes in boarders, all respectable women. if you reconsider." "I won't," Margaret interrupted. "But thank you for the suggestion and for your fairness today." Morrison touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, warrior." He gathered his men and rode off, leaving strange quiet in their wake. Margaret and Karuk remained frozen in tableau until the dust settled. Then, slowly, Karuk dismounted and approached the porch. "That was dangerous," Margaret said. "Coming here like that." "More dangerous to let lies stand unopposed," he replied. "Colton's words were poison. Poison spreads if not drawn out quickly. Still, you risked much." He looked at her directly then, and something in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "Some things are worth risk." They stood there, separated by the porch steps but connected by something neither could name. Finally, Margaret asked, "Would you like some water? For you and your horse?" "Yes," he said simply. She brought water, and they sat on the porch steps, not quite proper, not quite improper, existing in that gray space between worlds that seemed to define their entire relationship. "The captain was right," Margaret said eventually. "Colton won't give up. He'll find another way." "Then we must be like the spider," Karuk said, aware of every vibration in the web, ready to act when danger comes. Margaret looked at him sideways. "Since when is there a we in this situation?" "Since you chose not to run when you saw me. Since I chose to show myself. Since we both chose to speak truth today instead of convenient lies." Margaret considered this. "The captain was also right that your presence complicates things. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. People always talk. The crow gossips to the raven to the hawk. It changes nothing. It changes how they treat me. A white woman who associates with Indians becomes something else in their eyes, something less than respectable." Karuk was quiet for a moment. "Do you care so much for their respect?" Margaret thought about the women in town who'd come to Thomas's funeral, their eyes already calculating how long before she'd need a new husband, their whispers about the unsuitability of a woman alone. She thought about Jake Colton's grasping hands and assumed ownership. "No," she said finally. "I suppose I don't." "Then perhaps something good comes from this danger." Karuk suggested. "Truth revealed. False friends exposed. Real allies found. Is that what we are, allies? What would you call us?" Margaret didn't have an answer. Friends seemed too simple for the complex dance they performed. Neighbors too distant for people who'd shared dawn's sacred silence. Anything more was impossible, forbidden by laws written and unwritten. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm glad you came today. Glad you spoke for me." "You spoke for yourself. I only confirmed what the captain could already see." They sat in companionable silence as the afternoon sun slanted across the desert. Karuk's horse dozed in the shade, tail swishing at flies. The ordinary peacefulness of the moment stood in sharp contrast to the morning's drama. "I should go," Karuk said eventually. "It's not safe to be seen here too long." "Will you come to the spring tomorrow?" He smiled slightly. Where else would the deer seek water? After he left, Margaret remained on the porch, watching the empty horizon. The morning had brought danger and salvation in equal measure. Jake Colton was now an open enemy, but she'd gained something unexpected: acknowledgement from the army and, more importantly, proof that Karuk would stand for her when it mattered. She touched the carved bear in her pocket, thinking about the threads that connected people across all the artificial boundaries humans created. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, she had the memory of Karuk facing down her accusers, of Captain Morrison choosing justice over prejudice, of truth spoken plainly in the desert sun. It wasn't love, she told herself again, but it was something precious, nonetheless. The recognition that she wasn't alone, that someone saw her truly and found her worth defending. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret finally went inside. She had water to haul, animals to tend, a life to maintain against all odds. But first, she took out paper and pen and wrote a single line in her journal. Today, I learned the weight of the word we. Tomorrow, she would go to the spring again, and Kuruk would be there, her unlikely ally in a world that wanted them to be enemies. It was dangerous, complicated, probably foolish. But as she'd learned today, some things were worth the risk. The morning mist clung to the cottonwoods like spirits reluctant to leave their earthly haunts. Margaret made her way to the spring, her footsteps careful on the dew-slicked stones. It had been a week since the confrontation with Captain Morrison, and each day had brought a deepening of the strange bond between her and Kuruk. She found him already there, sitting cross-legged by the water's edge, his eyes closed in what might have been prayer or simple contemplation. He didn't move as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence. They had developed this awareness of each other, a sensitivity to the other's movements that needed no words. "You're early," she said softly, not wanting to disturb the morning's peace too abruptly. His eyes opened, dark and calm as the deep pools of the spring. "The deer were restless last night. When the animals are uneasy, it's wise to listen." Margaret set down her bucket and rifle, then surprised herself by sitting beside him on the sandy bank instead of maintaining the careful distance they'd observed until now. "What do you think disturbed them?" "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything." He turned to look at her fully. "You're different this morning." She was different, though she couldn't have said exactly how. The past week had been a series of small revelations, moments of connection that had accumulated like sand grains forming a pearl. Yesterday, he had shown her how to read weather signs in the clouds. The day before, she had taught him the English words for things he'd only known in Navajo. Each exchange had drawn them closer, worn away the barriers between their worlds like water over stone. "I've been thinking," she said, watching the play of early light on the water, "about what Captain Morrison said, about what everyone says, that this," she gestured between them, "is impossible." "Many things are impossible until they aren't." Kuruk replied, "My grandfather told of a spring that ran uphill, of stones that sang, of men who flew like birds. All impossible, all true. This is different. This is about people, about laws and customs and fear," he finished. "Always fear at the root, fear of difference, of change, of losing what they think they possess." Margaret pulled her knees to her chest, a girlish gesture that made her seem younger than her years. "Aren't you afraid?" "Every day," he admitted. "I fear for my people, pushed always further from our lands. I fear the hunger in white men's eyes that is never satisfied. I fear—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I fear losing this, whatever this is, these mornings, these conversations, this peace between us." The admission hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and precious. Margaret found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a gravity she no longer tried to resist. "Yesterday," she said, "when you showed me how to find water by watching the birds, your hand touched mine." "Yes. It was the first time since Thomas died that anyone has touched me with gentleness, without wanting something, without trying to possess or pity or push." She looked at him directly. "Do you understand what that means to a woman like me, to be seen as myself, not as a widow or a conquest or a problem to be solved?" Kuruk was quiet for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from bow and rain, warm and steady. "Among my people," he said, "when a man and woman choose each other, they sit together before the sunrise. They watch the world wake. They let the light bless what grows between them." He squeezed her hand gently. "We have been doing this without knowing it." Margaret's heart hammered so hard she was sure he must feel it through their joined hands. "Kuruk, we can't—" "Can't what can't speak truth, can't find comfort in dark times, can't choose our own path." can't pretend the world will accept this. I don't ask the world to accept. I ask only what you accept. She turned their hands over, studying the contrast, his bronze, hers pale, both marked by work and weather. My mother would die of shame. The town already whispers. If they knew. If they knew, he said gently. What would change? They already name you strange for living alone, for refusing Colton, for surviving where softer women would flee. Will their words hurt more than their actions already have? Margaret thought of the women in town who crossed the street rather than speak to her, of the men who looked at her like hungry dogs eyeing a bone. She thought of Jake Colton's threats and grasping hands. No, she whispered. I suppose they wouldn't. Karuk shifted, turning to face her more fully. With his free hand, he reached up and touched her face, fingers barely grazing her cheek. You are like the morning star, he said, bright and alone and brave. I would not dim your light with my shadow. You're not a shadow, Margaret said fiercely. You're the first real thing I've felt since Thomas died, maybe the first real thing I've ever felt. Your husband was a good man who wanted a good wife. I tried to be what he needed, but I never... She struggled for words. I never felt seen, not the way you see me, not as I truly am. Karuk's thumb traced the line of her jaw, and Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the gentleness of it. When she opened them, he was closer, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to share breath. This is the moment, he said softly, where we choose, step back, and we remain what we were. Careful friends, cautious allies. Step forward, and we become something there's no word for, Margaret finished. There are words, just not in English. His voice was barely above a whisper. In my language, there is a word for the one who shares your spirit. Not husband or wife, beyond friend or lover. Someone who is simply necessary. Like breath, like water. What is the word? Shayani, my completion. Margaret's last walls crumbled. She leaned forward, closing the space between them, and their lips met in a kiss that was both ending and beginning. It was gentle, almost hesitant, nothing like the passionate embraces she'd read about in novels. Instead, it was recognition, acceptance, a seal on truths too deep for ordinary words. When they parted, both were trembling slightly. The sun had risen fully, painting the spring in shades of gold and green. Everything changes now, Margaret said, not a question but an acknowledgement. Yes, Karuk agreed, but not as much as you might think. I will still come to the spring. You will still be the woman who stands strong against the world. We will still share food and stories and silence. Only now, we know what we are to each other. And what are we? He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. We are two people who choose each other despite all the reasons not to. Is that not enough? Margaret found herself smiling back, feeling lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. My practical nature says no, but my heart. What does your heart say? Instead of answering with words, she kissed him again, this time with more confidence. His arms came around her, and for a moment they were just two people beside a spring, blessed by morning light, complicated by nothing more than the universal challenge of two hearts trying to beat as one. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Margaret laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the canyon walls. I feel like a girl again, she admitted, foolish and reckless and alive. You are alive, Karuk said seriously. For the first time since I began watching, you are fully alive. This is good. They sat together as the morning progressed, hands linked, talking of everything and nothing. Karuk told her stories of his childhood, of learning to hunt with his father, of the ceremonies that marked a boy's passage to manhood. Margaret shared memories of Connecticut winters, of the books she'd loved, of her dreams of adventure that had led her west with Thomas. "I never imagined this," she said at one point. "When I dreamed of the frontier, I thought of land and freedom and starting fresh. I never thought of sitting with a savage by a spring," Kuruk suggested, but his tone was teasing. "Of finding someone who understands silence," she corrected. "Who knows that sometimes the most important things can't be said, only felt." "My grandmother would have liked you," he said. "She used to say that white people talk too much, always filling the air with noise, but you know when to speak and when to let the world speak for itself." "Tell me about her." So he did, painting pictures with words of a woman strong and wise, keeper of stories and healing herbs. Margaret listened, understanding that in sharing these memories, he was giving her pieces of his soul. The sun climbed higher, and eventually, responsibility called. Margaret needed to tend her garden, haul water, do the 1,000 tasks that kept her small homestead functioning. But leaving felt different now, charged with new meaning. "Tomorrow," she asked as they rose. "And all the tomorrows after," he promised, then, more seriously. "But we must be careful. What happened here? If others knew." "I know." She touched his face one last time. "But I'm tired of living in fear of what others might think or do. Aren't you?" "Fear and caution are not the same. We can choose each other and still be wise about it." Margaret nodded. Understanding. They would have to be discreet, careful. Their moments would be stolen, precious because of their rarity. It wasn't the love story she'd read about in books, full of public declarations and social acceptance, but it was real, and it was theirs. As she gathered her things, Kuruk caught her hand one last time. "Shiani," he said softly. "Remember this word. When the world tries to tell you this is wrong, remember that in my language, you have always existed. The one who completes, I was just waiting to find you." Margaret blinked back tears. "And in my language, what word is there for you?" He thought for a moment. "Perhaps there is no word because your people don't believe such things exist, but that doesn't make it less true." She left him by the spring, but carried him with her, in the warmth where their hands had joined, in the tender place where his lips had touched hers, in the fullness of a heart that had learned to beat again. That night, as she wrote in her journal, she tried to capture the magnitude of what had happened, but words failed her. How could mere letters convey the earthquake of two souls recognizing each other across impossible divides? Finally, she wrote simply, "Today I learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to choose love over fear. Tomorrow, I will choose again, and again, until all my tomorrows are used up." Outside, the desert stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human laws and prejudices, and somewhere in that vast darkness, another heartbeat in rhythm with hers, counting the hours until dawn would bring them together again. It was dangerous. It was impossible. It was the truest thing she'd ever known. And it was only the beginning. The weeks that followed their first kiss by the spring passed in a blur of stolen moments and careful meetings. Margaret had never known such happiness could exist alongside such constant wariness. Every dawn brought Kuruk to the spring, and their time together had become a sacred ritual of learning and sharing. This morning, she found him teaching her to track deer through the sandy soil near the water's edge. His hand covered hers as he guided her fingers over the faint impressions. "See here," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "The depth tells you the animal's weight. The spacing shows its gait, walking, running, limping." Margaret tried to focus on the lesson, but his nearness made concentration difficult. "And this," she pointed to a scrape mark beside the hoofprint. The deer was favoring its left front leg, perhaps an old injury, perhaps a stone bruise. His hand squeezed hers gently. "You're learning quickly." "I have a good teacher." She turned to face him, marveling again at how natural it felt to be close to him. Though I'm not sure tracking deer will help me much with growing corn. All knowledge is connected, Kuruk said, standing and pulling her up with him. Understanding how animals move teaches patience, observation. These help in all things. They walked along the spring's edge, fingers intertwined. In the past weeks, Kuruk had taught her so much: how to find edible plants in the desert, how to predict weather by watching cloud formations, how to move silently through the brush. In return, she had shared her own knowledge, letters and words, the mathematics of crop rotation, the hymns her mother had taught her transformed into simple songs of daily life. "I've been thinking," Margaret said as they settled in their usual spot beneath the largest cottonwood, "about what you said. Shiani, completion. What of it? Thomas and I were married for 4 years. We worked side by side, shared a bed, built a life together. But I never felt—" She searched for words. "I never felt like I could be fully myself. There was always some part held back, some piece that didn't fit the shape of wife I was supposed to fill." Kuruk listened quietly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "With you," she continued, "I don't have to be anything but Margaret, not the widow Walsh, not the stubborn woman who won't sell her land, not the scandalous female who bathes at dawn, just myself. This is because we see each other without the eyes of our peoples." Kuruk said, "I don't see you as whites see their women weak things to be protected and controlled. You don't see me as whites see my people, savage, dangerous, less than human. We see only each other." "Is that enough?" Margaret asked, voicing the fear that haunted her quiet moments. Can two people exist outside their worlds forever? Before Kuruk could answer, a sound made them both freeze, horses approaching. Moving fast, they scrambled apart, years of caution taking over. Kuruk melted into the brush with practiced ease, while Margaret grabbed her rifle and moved to a defensive position. But the rider who appeared wasn't Jake Colton or his men. It was a young woman on a lathered mare, her face flushed with exertion and what looked like tears. Margaret recognized her. Sarah Mills, the schoolmaster's daughter from town. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah called out, nearly falling from her horse in her haste to dismount. "Please, I need help. I didn't know where else to go." Margaret lowered her rifle, though she remained wary. "What's happened?" "It's Mr. Colton," Sarah gasped, trying to catch her breath. "He's saying terrible things about you in town. He's got men riled up, talking about Indian raids and white women being—" She colored, unable to finish. "Being what?" Margaret asked grimly, though she could guess. "Corrupted," Sarah whispered. "He says you've taken up with a savage, that you're a danger to decent folk. My father tried to speak reason, but Colton has the mayor's ear, and there's talk of forming a committee to investigate." Margaret's blood ran cold. A committee meant vigilantes, meant violence disguised as civic duty. "Why come to warn me?" Margaret asked. "Your reputation. You were kind to me after Mother died." Sarah interrupted. "When everyone else just saw the schoolmaster's daughter, you saw a grieving girl. You brought me food, sat with me." Tears ran down her cheeks. "I couldn't let them hurt you without warning." Margaret pulled the girl into a quick embrace. "Thank you. How long do I have?" "They're meeting tonight at the saloon. Father thinks they'll come tomorrow. Maybe the day after. They want to seem official. Have papers drawn up." "Papers for what?" Sarah's voice dropped. "To have you declared unfit to hold property. They say a woman who consorts with Indians can't be trusted with land ownership. It would revert to the town for sale." "And let me guess who would buy it." "Mr. Colton's already drawn up an offer." Rage filled Margaret, hot and cleansing, after Sarah left, promising to send word if she learned more. Margaret stood by the spring, shaking with fury. "You heard?" she asked the apparently empty air. Kuruk emerged from concealment, his face dark with anger. "I heard, this Colton is like a coyote, Always circling, always looking for weakness. What do I do? Margaret asked, hating the desperation in her voice. I can't fight the whole town. You won't be alone. Kuruk moved to her, pulling her into his arms. My people have experience with white men's papers and legal tricks. But Margaret, he pulled back to look at her. This danger is because of me. If I leave, if they don't see me again. No. The word came out fiercer than she intended. Don't you dare. Don't you dare let them win by driving you away. I would rather leave than see you hurt. And I would rather fight than live as a coward. She gripped his arms. Besides, do you really think Colton would stop just because you left? He wants my land. You're just his excuse. Kuruk was quiet for a moment, then nodded. You're right. A predator doesn't stop because one deer escapes. It only grows hungrier. So what do? We prepare, and we use their own laws against them. They spent the rest of the morning planning. Kuruk knew of a lawyer in Santa Fe who had helped some of his people with land disputes, an unusual white man who believed in justice over profit. Margaret had papers from Thomas, proper deeds and certificates that proved her ownership, if they could get to Santa Fe before the vigilantes came. It's 3 days' ride, Margaret said, calculating quickly. If I leave tonight... We leave tonight, Kuruk corrected. I won't let you travel alone. Kuruk, if they see us together, then they see the truth, that you are not alone, not unprotected, not the easy target they believe. His jaw set stubbornly. I have hidden long enough. It's time to step into the light. Margaret kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and gratitude into the contact. When they parted, both were breathing hard. We should go to your home. Kuruk said, Gather what you need. I'll meet you after sunset with horses. Where will you get horses? He smiled grimly. My nephew keeps our family's herd in a canyon not far from here. Good horses, desert bred. They'll outrun anything Colton's men ride. They parted reluctantly, each to their preparations. Margaret spent the afternoon gathering essential papers, a few precious belongings, and supplies for the journey. She worked with desperate efficiency, trying not to think about what she was leaving behind. Thomas's grave, the garden she'd coaxed from desert soil, the home they'd built with their own hands. As the sun set, she heard horses approaching. Her heart leaped, thinking Kuruk had come early, but the voice that called out made her blood freeze. Mrs. Walsh, we know you're in there. Jake Colton. He hadn't waited for official sanction after all. Margaret grabbed her rifle and moved to the window. 5 men sat horses in her yard, Colton at their head. They carried torches. Though it wasn't yet full dark, a theatrical touch meant to intimidate. What do you want? Colton, she called out. Justice, he replied, voice carrying that false righteousness she'd come to hate. You've been seen with that savage. Good Christian folk won't stand for it. Good Christian folk should mind their own business. Your business became ours when you chose a redskin over your own kind, one of the other men shouted. Margaret didn't recognize him, probably one of Colton's hired thugs. Come out now, and we'll escort you to town peacefully. Colton said, Make us come in, and things might get unpleasant. Margaret's mind raced. Where was Kuruk if he arrived now, with Colton's men ready for violence? I need time to gather my things, she called out, stalling. 5 minutes. Colton replied, Then we come in. Margaret used the time to barricade the door and check her ammunition. She had maybe 20 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged fight. Through the back window, she scanned for any sign of Kuruk. Time's up, Colton shouted. The men dismounted, moving toward her door with purposeful strides. Margaret raised her rifle, sighting through the window. First man to touch my door gets a bullet, she warned. They paused, but Colton sneered. You won't shoot. Women don't have the stomach for killing. This woman does, Margaret said coldly. Ask your friend Samuel about the rattlesnake I shot off his boot last spring. My aim hasn't gotten worse." The men exchanged uncertain looks. Samuel, she noticed, had taken a step back. Then, from the darkness beyond the torchlight, came a sound that raised the hair on every neck. A war cry, fierce and primal. Arrows whistled from the darkness, striking the ground at the men's feet with uncanny accuracy. "Indians!" someone screamed. "We're surrounded!" More war cries echoed from different directions. In the confusion, Margaret saw Kuruk materialize from the shadows. Bow drawn, every inch the warrior. But he wasn't alone. 2 other native men flanked him, also armed. "The woman is under our protection," Kuruk announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Leave now, and live. Stay, and test whether your bullets are faster than our arrows in the dark." Colton's men were already backing toward their horses, fear overcoming greed. But Colton himself stood firm, face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "The army will come. They'll hunt you down like the animals you are." "Perhaps," Kuruk said calmly. "But you won't be here to see it." The implied threat was clear. Colton finally moved, mounting his horse with clumsy haste. "This isn't over, woman," he shouted at Margaret. "You've chosen your side, now live with it." They thundered away in a cloud of dust and dropped torches. Kuruk and his companions waited until the hoofbeats faded before approaching the house. "Margaret," Kuruk called softly. "It's safe now." She emerged, rifle still in hand, to find Kuruk with 2 young native men, one clearly his nephew, sharing his strong features, the other a stranger. "This is Joseph," Kuruk said, indicating his nephew. "And his friend Robert. They came when I sent word." "Ma'am," Joseph said politely, touching his hat brim in a gesture learned from whites. "Uncle says you need safe passage to Santa Fe." "Thank you," Margaret said, still shaking from the confrontation. "I'm grateful for your help." "Family helps family," Robert said simply. "Uncle Kuruk says you're family now." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly broke her composure. Kuruk moved to her side, his presence steadying. "We need to leave quickly," he said. "Colton will gather more men, maybe ride to the fort. We have a few hours lead at most." Margaret nodded, pushing aside emotion for practicality. In 20 minutes, they were mounted and moving. Margaret on a sturdy paint mare, her most essential belongings in saddlebags. She looked back once at the dark silhouette of her home against the stars. "We'll come back," Kuruk said softly, reading her thoughts. "Will we?" she asked. "After this? Different than before, perhaps. But yes, this land has claimed you as you've claimed it. Such bonds don't break easily." As they rode into the desert night, guided by stars and Kuruk's knowledge of hidden trails, Margaret felt the shape of her life changing. She was no longer the widow Walsh, trying to maintain respectability while her heart pulled her elsewhere. She had chosen, publicly and irrevocably. The man riding beside her reached over and took her hand. "No regrets?" he asked. Margaret thought of the home she was leaving, the gossip that would follow, the uncertain future ahead. Then she looked at Kuruk, her teacher, her protector, her completion, and squeezed his hand. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only tomorrow." They rode on through the darkness, 4 unlikely companions bound by choice and circumstance. Behind them, the old life burned away like morning mist. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited whatever future 2 people could build when they refused to let the world define the boundaries of their love. It would not be easy, but then nothing worthwhile ever was. The lawyer's office in Santa Fe was a narrow room squeezed between a mercantile and a boarding house. But James Martinez possessed the kind of quiet authority that made the cramped space feel like a courthouse. He listened to Margaret's story without interruption, occasionally making notes. his dark eyes moving between her and Karuk with professional assessment. "Your papers are in order," he said finally, setting down the deed to Margaret's property. Thomas Walsh was thorough. "The land is legally yours. Widow's rights clearly established." However, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "The situation is complicated by the current political climate." "Because I'm a woman alone?" Margaret asked. "Because of him," Martinez said, nodding toward Karuk. "The territory is looking for excuses to push the tribes further west. Any association between whites and natives is being used as evidence of Indian influence that threatens settlements." Karuk, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "So they use their fear of my people to steal from their own?" "Precisely," Martinez agreed. "It's happened before. A widow in Taos lost her ranch last year. They claimed she was corrupted by trading too freely with the Pueblo. The land went to auction within a week." Margaret felt her heart sink. "Then we've come for nothing." "Not nothing." Martinez leaned back, steepling his fingers. "There's a way, but you may not like it." "Tell me." "Marriage," he said simply. "A married woman's property becomes her husband's to protect. No committee can declare a man unfit to hold land simply for associating with Indians. Half the traders in the territory would lose their businesses." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret couldn't look at Karuk, couldn't process what Martinez was suggesting. "That's impossible," she finally managed. "The law doesn't recognize mixed marriages." Martinez smiled grimly. "No, not officially, but there are ways. Common law marriages, marriages by bond rather than ceremony. I've drawn up such documents before." "For white women and native men?" Margaret asked skeptically. "For people who needed legal protection more than social approval," Martinez replied. "The document would need to be filed here in Santa Fe, away from your local prejudices. It wouldn't be announced, wouldn't be celebrated, but it would be legal enough to protect your land." Margaret finally looked at Karuk. His face was unreadable, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself still. "We need to discuss this," she said. Martinez nodded. "I'll give you privacy. But Mrs. Walsh time is a factor. If Colton has connections, he'll move quickly." After the lawyer left, Margaret and Karuk sat in silence. The weight of what had been suggested pressed down like summer heat. "It would be a lie," Margaret said finally. "A paper marriage to protect property." "Would it?" Karuk asked quietly. She looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "We have shared the sunrise ceremony. We have chosen each other as Shiani. Among my people, this is marriage. The paper would only tell your people what mine already know." "Karuk." Margaret's voice broke. "This isn't how it should be. Hidden away, signed in secret, denied and disguised." He moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "How should it be? Should we wait for a world that accepts us? Should we let them take your land while we wish for different times? You would do this bind yourself in their laws to protect what's mine. I would bind myself to you in any law, under any sky, before any witness who would see us." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "The question is not what I would do, but what you can accept." Margaret looked into his eyes, seeing the truth there. This wasn't about land or protection, not really. It was about choosing each other fully. Consequences be damned. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back. Legal or not, binding or not, in the eyes of the world you would be my husband. A white woman who married an Indian. And I would be a Navajo who married a white. My people will not all understand either. What will your family say?" Karuk was quiet for a moment. "Joseph understands. He walks between worlds already. Others, some will say I betray our ways. But Margaret, my people know about adaptation. We bend like the willow to survive the storm. This is just another kind of bending." Margaret freed one hand to touch his face. I never wanted to be the storm you had to survive. You're not the storm. You're the tree worth bending for. The poetry of it broke her last resistance. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Not for the land, not for protection, but because I can't imagine a tomorrow without you in it. Karuk rose, pulling her up and into his arms. The kiss they shared was different from their gentle explorations by the spring. This carried the weight of decision, of futures chosen and bridges burned. When Martinez returned, they were composed, sitting side by side with joined hands. We'll need witnesses, Martinez said, already pulling out documents. 2 citizens of good standing who can attest to your arrangement. I can witness, Joseph said from the doorway. None of them had heard him enter, but his presence felt like a blessing. And Robert will too, if needed. Martinez looked uncertain. Native witnesses might complicate? I'll witness. Everyone turned to find a woman in the doorway, elderly but straight-backed, wearing the severe dress of a schoolmistress. Mrs. Elmsworth. Martinez sounded shocked. I didn't expect... You helped my grandson when those land grabbers tried to steal his father's farm, she said crisply. I pay my debts. She looked at Margaret and Karuk with sharp blue eyes. Besides, I've lived long enough to know that love doesn't always come in the expected packages. If these 2 have found something real, who are we to deny it? And so, in a small office in Santa Fe, with an elderly schoolteacher and 2 young native men as witnesses, Margaret Walsh became Margaret Red Crow, taking the name Karuk offered from his clan. Martinez drew up the papers with meticulous care, creating a document that was both marriage certificate and property protection. It won't stop all challenges, he warned as they signed, but it makes them much harder. A man's property rights are nearly sacred in the territory. And my rights, Margaret asked wryly, are now protected by his, Martinez admitted. I don't like it any more than you do, but we work with the laws we have, not the ones we wish for. After everything was signed and sealed, they stood awkwardly in the afternoon sun outside Martinez's office. The world looked the same, but everything had changed. What now? Margaret asked. Now we rest. Karuk said practically, Joseph knows a place, a boarding house that asks few questions. Tomorrow we start back. Back to face Colton the town. Back to claim what's ours, he corrected. We have law on our side now. Let them challenge it if they dare. The boarding house was indeed discreet, though Margaret saw the proprietor's eyes widen slightly when Karuk signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Red Crow. Their room was small but clean, with a window overlooking a courtyard where children played. As night fell, they sat together on the narrow bed, still fully clothed, navigating this new reality. I don't know how to be a wife again, Margaret admitted. And I certainly don't know how to be your wife in a world that says we shouldn't exist. Then don't be. Karuk said simply. Be Margaret who knows the spring's secrets. Be the woman who stands in dawnlight unafraid. Be yourself, just as you've always been with me. And can you be yourself as my husband? He considered this. I will be changed. In your world, I become Margaret's Indian, a curiosity, a scandal. In mine, I may become the one who chose whites, a cautionary tale. He took her hand. But with you, I am just Karuk. That is enough. They talked deep into the night, about practical things like defending the ranch, about dreams like the children they might have, about fears neither had voiced before. When words finally ran out, they lay together, still clothed, finding comfort in simply being close. Margaret Red Crow, she said softly in the darkness. It sounds strange. All new names sound strange until they become part of you. Karuk replied, like learning a new language. At first the words feel foreign on your tongue. Then one day you realize you're thinking in them. Will we have a ceremony, a real one, by your traditions? If you want, when the danger passes, when we can gather my family safely. I want, she said firmly. This paper makes us married in the eyes of the law. But I want to be married in the eyes of your people too, and in the eyes of whatever God watches over unions like ours. Karuk pulled her closer. My grandmother used to say that the spirits bless all love that makes the world larger rather than smaller. What we have makes the world larger, bridging peoples, challenging hate. I think we are already blessed. A knock at the door interrupted them. They tensed, but it was only Joseph. Uncle, he said through the door. Robert's returned from scouting. Colton's men are asking questions in town. We should leave before dawn. We'll be ready, Karuk replied. As Joseph's footsteps faded, Margaret sat up. It's starting already. We've been married less than 6 hours and already we're running. Not running, Karuk corrected. Moving strategically. There's a difference. Is there, because it feels like we'll always be one step ahead of trouble. He sat up too, cupping her face in his hands. Perhaps, but Margaret, would you rather be safe and alone? Would you trade what we have for Colton's approval? For the town's acceptance? No, she said without hesitation. Not for all the safety in the world. Then we face what comes together. They prepared for departure in the pre-dawn darkness, working with the wordless coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms. As they loaded the horses, Mrs. Elmsworth appeared with a packet of food and unexpected advice. I was married to a man my parents hated, she said quietly. An Irish Catholic in a Protestant family. We had 30 good years before the fever took him. She pressed the packet into Margaret's hands. The world will try to make you regret choosing love over convention. Don't let it. The only real regret is the love we don't allow ourselves to have. As they rode out of Santa Fe, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten, Margaret thought about regret and choice, about names and ceremonies, about the strange paths that lead to belonging. Beside her, Karuk rode steady and sure. Her husband-in-law, if not yet in the eyes of their communities. They had 3 days' ride ahead, 3 days before facing whatever waited in the town they'd fled. But for now, in this moment between night and dawn, they were simply two people who had chosen each other against all odds. The sunrise, when it came, blessed them with colors of fire and gold, and Margaret, now Margaret Red Crow, took it as a sign that some things were worth any price, any challenge, any amount of running or fighting or adapting. Love was one of those things, the land was another, and the freedom to choose both, that was worth everything. Ready? Karuk asked, as the trail ahead became clear in the growing light. Ready? Margaret replied, and meant it. They spurred their horses forward, toward home and conflict and whatever future they could carve from an unwelcoming world. Behind them, Santa Fe slept on, unaware that it had harbored a small revolution, a quiet declaration of independence written not in grand speeches, but in simple documents that said two people had the right to choose each other. It wasn't the wedding either had imagined in youth, but it was theirs, real and legal and binding. And that, Margaret thought as she rode beside her husband into the new day, was its own kind of perfect. The adobe house stood unchanged in the afternoon sun, but Margaret saw it differently now, not as the widow Walsh's lonely homestead, but as the Red Crow Ranch. Hers and Karuk's together, they approached cautiously, Joseph and Robert flanking them, alert for any sign of ambush. Empty, Robert confirmed after scouting the perimeter. But someone's been here. Fresh horse tracks, maybe 2 days old. Inside, they found evidence of search drawers pulled out, papers scattered, but the house itself was intact. No vandalism or destruction. Even Thomas's books remained on their shelf. They were looking for something specific. Karuk observed, examining the disturbance. Legal documents, perhaps proof of ownership. Margaret smiled grimly. which are safe in Mr. Martinez's office, with copies filed at the territorial registry. She moved through the house, setting things right, reclaiming her space. Let them search. They'll find nothing to support their claims. Over the following days, they established a new routine. Joseph and Robert set up camp near the spring, keeping watch while helping with the heavier work of repairing fences and hauling water. Margaret returned to her garden, salvaging what the brief absence hadn't killed, and Kuruk moved between worlds, hunting with his nephew at dawn, working alongside Margaret through the day, teaching her more of his language in the evening. The first test came a week later. Sheriff Brennan rode out alone, his weathered face carefully neutral as he dismounted at the porch where Margaret and Kuruk sat mending harnesses. Mrs. Walsh, he began, then paused, clearly unsure how to proceed. Or should I say Mrs. Red Crow? Either works, Sheriff, Margaret replied calmly. Though legally, it's Red Crow now. Brennan removed his hat, turning it in his hands. So it's true then. You've married. We have. Kuruk's voice was steady, neither defensive nor aggressive. Is that why you've come? Partly. The sheriff sighed. Folks in town are stirred up. Colton's been talking, saying things that aren't fit to repeat. There's pressure on me to do something about the Indian situation out here. And what will you do? Margaret asked. Brennan met her eyes directly. My job, ma'am, which is to keep the peace and uphold the law. Far as I can tell, no laws have been broken. A woman's got the right to marry who she chooses, and a man's got the right to protect his property. Even when that man is Navajo, Kuruk asked. The law doesn't specify color, Brennan said carefully, though I'll admit it's causing complications I've never dealt with before. He replaced his hat, businesslike now. I came to warn you. There's talk of bringing in federal marshals, claiming this is a territorial matter beyond my jurisdiction. Colton's got connections in the capital. Let them come, Margaret said. Our marriage is legal. Our papers are in order. We've done nothing wrong. Maybe not, but right and wrong don't always matter when politics get involved. Brennan mounted his horse. Watch yourselves, and, for what it's worth, your husband's intervention saved Sam Morrison from a rattler last spring when they were scouting. Sam hasn't forgotten. You've got more friends than you might think. After the sheriff left, they sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Joseph spoke from where he'd been listening. He's a good man, for a white. He's a good man, period, Margaret corrected gently. Just as there are good and bad among all peoples. And he speaks wisdom, Robert said with a grin, using the title he and Joseph had adopted for her. Uncle chose well. That night, Kuruk fulfilled a promise, in the traditional way of his people. They held a simple ceremony by the spring. Joseph and Robert served as witnesses while Kuruk wrapped a blanket around himself and Margaret, speaking words in Navajo that bound them by older laws than any courthouse recognized. Now we are married in both worlds, he said as they stood in the blanket's shelter. The paper satisfied your law. This satisfies mine. And this? Margaret asked, producing a worn Bible that had been her mother's. Would you mind if we read something to satisfy the world I came from? Kuruk smiled. Read. She chose verses about love enduring all things, about two becoming one. The words, spoken under stars beside the ancient spring, seemed to carry more weight than they ever had in any church. Months passed. The threatened federal marshals never materialized, though whether due to bureaucratic delays or Sheriff Brennan's reports that all was peaceful, they never knew. The town gradually, grudgingly, began to accept the new reality. Some still crossed the street when Margaret came to trade, but others nodded politely. The schoolmaster's daughter Sarah began visiting, bringing news and staying for lessons in traditional weaving that Kuruk taught them both. Jake Colton made one final attempt. He arrived with legal papers, claiming the marriage was invalid, that miscegenation laws forbade such unions. But Martinez had anticipated this, providing documentation that such laws didn't yet exist in the territory, that federal precedent supported marriage as a contract between consenting adults. "You've won this round," Colton snarled as Sheriff Brennan escorted him off the property again. "But this isn't over. Change is coming to the territory. Laws that will put everyone in their proper place." "Change is always coming," Karuk observed after he'd gone. "The question is whether we direct it or are swept away by it." Margaret discovered she was pregnant as the first winter storms approached. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. A child who would belong fully to neither world, who would face challenges she could only imagine. "Our child will be a bridge," Karuk said when she voiced her fears. "Like the spring that feeds both desert and garden, belonging to all, limited by none." They expanded the house that winter, adding rooms with the help of both native craftsmen from Karuk's extended family and white neighbors who decided the Red Crows were assets to the community. It was during this building that the photograph was taken, the one Margaret would treasure all her days. A traveling photographer, documenting the changing frontier, asked to capture the unusual household. In the image, Margaret stood proud and straight, her pregnancy just showing beneath her apron. Karuk sat beside her, dignified in his mixture of traditional and adopted dress. Joseph and Robert flanked them like protective brothers. Even Sarah had joined them, representing the unexpected friendships that had grown. But it was Karuk's expression that Margaret would always remember, looking directly into the camera with that same steady gaze he'd given her that first morning by the spring, seeing truly without fear or pretense. Their daughter was born as spring returned to the desert. They named her Merry Dancing Water Red Crow, honoring both traditions. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's strong features, beautiful in a way that transcended simple categories. Years flowed like the spring itself, constant yet ever-changing. More children followed. Thomas Eagle Eye, who would become a teacher, bridging worlds through education. Anna Laughing Star, who would marry the sheriff's son and help integrate the growing town. James Two Paths, who would study law and fight for native rights in courts across the territory. Margaret grew silver-haired but never lost the straight spine that had carried her through those early trials. She taught all the children, her own and others who came to learn, about both worlds they inherited. The spring remained their sanctuary, the place where differences dissolved in the universal need for water, for life, for connection. Karuk aged into an elder respected by both communities. His wisdom sought in disputes, his knowledge of the land invaluable as droughts and floods tested everyone equally. He never lost his quiet way of seeing truth, of speaking only when words would add rather than diminish. They faced hardships, years when government policies turned cruel, when their children faced discrimination, when age and loss took their toll. But always they returned to the spring, to each other, to the choice they'd made when the world said it was impossible. Near the end, Margaret kept the photograph close, along with the carved bear Karuk had given her so long ago. "Look," she would tell her great-grandchildren, pointing to the figures in the fading image. "Your grandfather is looking at the camera as if he could see all the way to you, as if he knew you would need to see that such love was possible. Even then, the spring still flows, though the cottonwoods have grown ancient and the adobe house has been replaced by modern structures. But locals say that at dawn, if you know where to look, you can sometimes see shadows by the water. A woman standing unafraid in morning light. A man watching with recognition rather than desire. Two spirits who found each other across impossible odds and chose to build a world where such love could exist. Their graves lie side by side on the hill overlooking the spring. The headstones reading simply, Margaret Dancing Water Red Crow, 1832 to 1901 she chose courage, and Karuk Red Crow, 1830 to 1899. He saw truly. But their real monument isn't in stone. It's in the descendants who carry both bloodlines proudly, in the town that learned tolerance through their example, in the legal precedents their union helped establish, in every couple who looks past difference to find recognition, and in the spring itself, still bubbling up from hidden depths, still offering life to all who come seeking it, still whispering that some things are stronger than the barriers humans build. Love, water, the choice to see each other clearly in the morning light. The story ends as it began, with water and recognition, with choosing to step forward despite fear, with the revolutionary act of two people deciding they were more important than the world's objections. Some called it scandal, others called it tragedy. But for Margaret and Karuk, it was simply Tuesday by the spring, Wednesday in the garden, Thursday teaching children, Friday growing old together, a lifetime of ordinary days made extraordinary by the choice to live them together. And in the end, isn't that what all love stories are? Not grand gestures or perfect moments, but the daily decision to choose each other, again and again, until all the agains add up to always. The desert remembers, even if maps and laws forget. And somewhere, water still rises from the earth, carrying the memory of when two worlds met and chose not to remain separate, but to flow together towards something larger than either could be alone. Thank you for listening to this story of love and courage in the Old West. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know where in the world you're experiencing Margaret and Karuk's journey. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Tales, hit that like button, and don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover these forgotten stories of the American frontier. Your support helps keep these tales alive for future generations.